Hear me in back? Okay, good. Well, thanks for coming to, I think what might be the second to last of our readings in the Poem Present series. We have one more reading, which is our local talent reading coming up, which I urge you all to come to. It's always a lot of fun. We have our own students and graduate students and members of the community, and sometimes even a faculty member read their poems. But this is our last reading of the year, and I'd like to thank Hamza Walker and the Renaissance Society for co-sponsoring this event, along with the program in poetry and poetics. We'll be having a reception upstairs afterwards, so please do come and join us afterwards for wine and schmoozing, and the poet will be there as well. If you were a student at the University of Chicago in 1934, and if you were looking for something to do on a dreary Hyde Park afternoon, much like this, and if you had an extra 55 cents to spare for a cheap seat in Mandel Hall's auditorium, you might have found yourself listening to a lecture by a boxy lady from Paris named Gertrude Stein. Today, over 70 years later, and across the quad here in social sciences, we're going to hear one of Stein's most important literary successors, the poet Lyn Hejinian, read from her work. And free of charge, I might add. University support for avant-garde poetics has come a long way. I really do not know that anything has ever been more exciting than diagramming sentences, said Stein during one of these American lectures. I like the feeling, the everlasting feeling of sentences as they diagram themselves. In that way, one is completely possessing oneself and, incidentally, one's self. Though I myself admit I can think of a few things more exciting than diagramming sentences, this probably says more about my own lack of inner resources than about sentences themselves. In reading Hejinian's poetry, we can witness the thrill of the endlessly elaborating network of grammar unfolding a breathtaking diagram before our very eyes. And we can't help but like the feeling, the everlasting feeling of it. In her earlier work, such as the now classic My Life, originally written in 37 sections of 37 sentences each, one for each year of the 37-year-old author's life, this diagrammatic project yielded a way of possessing oneself and, incidentally, one's self. Framed within the movement of language writing, which she helped to found and foster, Hejinian's early work of self-construction also participated in the broader construction of new literary archives, theories, and practices that have radically transformed the art of poetry as we know it. Today, Hejinian's diagramming has extended outward even further to encompass an ever-expanding field of political, philosophical, musical, cinematic, and literary relations. In her recent collection, A Border Comedy, Hejinian gives us a small parable of this progression. I've read somewhere of a philosopher who drew a diagram of his life. A labyrinth but lacking spiral. A maze but without center. Without concentricity. No passage, no sound. But suddenly, how musical the mere thought of music becomes. The bird is out. We do not want all loss of boundary. At boundary is the body of experience. It affirms our solitude, but it negates it too. It makes conjunction, has beauty and clue. Like the Borgesian philosopher who draws a diagram of his life and finds it to be a maze without end, Hejinian's diagramming of knowledge and experience has led to a poetry of endless amazement. Somewhere along the way, comes the recognition that the bird is out, that the mere thought of music has, on its own, and seemingly without any help from us, become music itself. It makes conjunction. It has beauty and clue. Lyn Hejinian is the author or co-author of 14 books of poetry, including A Thought is the Bride of What Thinking, Writing as an Aid to Memory, My Life, The Cell, The Cold of Poetry, A Border Comedy, and The Fatalist. 2 volumes of her translations from the work of the contemporary Russian poet Arkady Dragomoshenko have been published by Sun and Moon Press. In 2000, the University of California Press published a collection of her essays titled The Language of Inquiry, and she was guest editor of the Best American Poetry in 2004. For nearly 10 years, she was editor of Tumba Press, and since 1981, she has been the co-editor of the Poetics Journal. Her honors include a writing fellowship from the California Arts Council, a grant from the Poetry Fund, a translation fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, and a fellowship from the Academy of the American Poets. She lives in Berkeley and teaches at the University of California, where everybody loves her. Please join me in welcoming Lyn Hejinian.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, Chico. It perfectly sets up what I want to do. Thanks also to Robert von Holberg, to Julia Klein, and to the many students and other faculty members who have come to talk to me or attended the talk yesterday. I've had a wonderful time here at the University of Chicago. I should especially commend the university for inviting Gertrude Stein to speak here in 1934. She then made her way west and came to the University of California, where it was decided that she was not a significant writer and was not permitted to deliver her talk on campus. So she delivered it in a residence building called International House, which is home to students from foreign countries. So she was, perhaps because she came from Paris, they thought, although she wasn't a real writer, at least she was a foreigner and could be there. Anyway, hooray for Chicago for recognizing her for what she was. I'm going to read first from a project which is an ongoing project, although I think it's near completion. And it's called Lola. A part of it was published in a little series curated out of New York City by 2 women who run a poetry reading series for women innovative poets, I think they call it, the Belladonna series. And each reading, they produce a little chapbook of work by the writer. So I'm going to read this somewhat coherent section from Lola. And it is not a poem, but a circus. And that's all I'll say by way of explanation at this point. There is, I think, a Q&A. Is that correct? After? Oh, there isn't. Well, then I'll say a little more about it. I wanted to... It's sort of an offshoot or an outgrowth of the Border Comedy Project, which is very elaborate and very long and involves a lot of clowning around, inadvertent clowning around. The idea being that when people get in border situations, that the rules are changing, the currency is no longer no longer has value, the language is no longer the same. A woman is turning into a goose or a dog or becoming French. And getting into trouble, and a lot of metamorphoses happen in the work, which is what its theme really is about. And it's an affirmation of the wonder of the border situation and an argument that it's the best place for us to be, and probably is where we are. Anyway, the clowning around interested me, and clearly circuses are the places where clowning takes place. I did quite a lot of reading about circuses, and discovered, got interested in how cruel they are. Not only in the predictable ways, that is, the training of the animals, but actually the conditions for circus workers in the heyday of the circuses. I can't speak to the contemporary circus, but in the heyday of the circuses, first the horse-drawn ones and then the railroad circuses, the conditions for the workers were just appalling. And numbers of workers died in the course of a circus season, putting up the big tents. Things collapsed, a lot of accidents happened, and then the workers themselves worked did grueling work, very difficult work, and had no home except a bed in a train car, etc. So anyway, this evolved by circus, and it is a circus. It's also a battlefield. There is a cruelty. There are some cruelties that are occurring. There is a plot of sorts, and there's even a story. Plot is the order in which things occur. Story is what occurred linearly. But it's not very important, and it will never be any clearer than it is today. So without any more comments about it, circuses have 3 rings, hence the 3 chapters that you'll hear. And the chapters are kind of big presences because in a circus you keep looking to them. So here's a little prelude. The dog on its leash knows the secret of freedom. This is promising, says Lola. Fanfare and ridiculous light. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Even before I existed, says Lola, I was already at work on myself. I came prepared. Along comes Lola. It is much easier to be enthusiastic about what exists than about what doesn't. Air and screams too, rubble, flitting litter, shadows, and all the rest slowly in disequilibrium, kept indefinitely before the senses of the payers by players yearning to share all their pleasure mercilessly, as if this were what they prepared for, that, to show their pleasures mercilessly. Chapter 2. Chapters admit events, chapters worlds apart, chapters in a mood, mid-air, in plumes. Sam comes along with binoculars, cash, gloves, a bridle, and a net. He says there's a bird with a rat and pears. There are didacts, a killer, 1 polymath, a mother, a Russian gymnast, occasional passers-by, and idle salespeople, a juggler, a man with a sore throat, and a sorrowful child with cold hands and a 3-legged dog on a leash, and all of these are players. The sisters Hertha, Drew, Nina, Abdul Tommy Ahmed, Trish O'Reilly, Kurt Krakauer, Ludmilla Kaipa, and Sue. Chapter 2. Along come a multitude of little things, illusions provided with reality, and reality with illusion too, a circus whose wings withdraw in disgust, spread doubt, produce warts, night falls, owls call, the moon comes up, the battlefield is lost in mist. The juggler tosses his pins, his plates spin, behind him the tumbler slips and falls into a soft, new, warm, coiled turd, just left by the clown pulling up his pants by green suspenders at the edge of the ring. Quinlan comes in from the dark off guard. He says, "What's the big deal?" But his hands are shaking. Chapter 1. Welcome. There will be interruptions that can't be helped. We're occupants of a tent quickly struck for a long time and removed to a new site. There are always many players, and help is not always on their side. Lola's on a bike. Helen is a largeness. Bill tumbles backward and jumps to his feet, pointing to the parking lot. Nina says she wishes it were a field in which she could pasture a trick cow. You can't train cows, says Bill. But Nina remains spontaneously reasonable. On some days she wakes to play placards, and on others to play the flute politically. And she says, "Look, I'm telling you what I saw, not what I know." That comes tellingly second. Players all have second things poignantly in mind. That's just what I said to my mother the day I was born, says Jeannie. A juggler attempts to seize everything at the very instant he lets it go. The juggler says the field doesn't leave us, we leave it. For all the years that my wife will live after me, though I'm dead, I'll long to be with her, says Bill. Lola cycles past. Graciela Parker is missing. Chapter 2. It is late afternoon and Lola goes with her shadow. 2 wagging caravans are crossing the horizon, one approaching, the other moving away, and as the one arrives, the other disappears. Both are like giants wallowing in years, some taken from others, leaving this one, the difference. Alice minus Carlos is Sam. 1999 minus ice is the 21st century. The hours Paloma put in at the shop minus the hours for which she is paid are the hours that turn a profit. Yesterday minus today. Sally Dover's family minus Sally Dover. But let's look on the plus side, says Maggie Fornetti to Helen, who has buttered her baked potato abundantly and is now dipping a chunk on her fork into the mayonnaise. If a cow were to be paired with a bird, the result would be sterile but beautiful, says Helen. But there's no way back from beauty to usefulness, says Maggie. Helen's lover, Sam, says, my lover resembles a house. In the distance, a train whistle blows. Mrs. Fornetti says, my daughter is more perfect than the finest melon or the daintiest birch or rooftops in Lisbon. The past does not return. Chapter 1. Sid is a young Marine. Quinlan is a player. Mrs. Parker is climbing the stairs, and in the grocery bag she holds in her arms are a starfish, a potato, a bottle of syrup, a map of Minnesota, a misspelled word, a sample of satin, and an ominous owl, a scream. Then along comes Chapter 2, for which everyone has practiced, and with it comes Chapter 3. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The apple in fall comes to rest near a man with his fortune rolled up in a ball that he caught on a dare as it bounced off a car, the door slightly ajar, a strange smell in the air. The lovers tumble to the side of spontaneity without wondering what it's for, what it can do, and declare it an uninterrupted round of pleasure. Along comes a juggler with a treasure, hiding jars in the air, made bright by the sun in the eyes of the lover, a beholder. A small cop tumbles into view, happening onto the scene without a clue, as if at fate's request to find a guy left high and dry whom he can arrest. Symptomatically, belligerently, Quinlan asks, what's dubious about Fritos? Did you know that cats that purr don't roar and cats that roar don't purr? Maggie Fornetti asks Ascari Nate Martin, who thinks perhaps he's being grilled. Helen says paranoia is archaic, Maggie says, full of old surprises. Ascari Nate Martin notes that conversations in real life rarely move directly from A, derived from elements of the theme being developed, to B, derived from completely different elements using completely different talents. But still, the conversations give birth to the image in which the matter is most clearly embodied. The juggler juggles with jugs that have been prepared. The tumbler is him or herself prepared. The result will produce in the spectators a complete image of something other than the theme itself. Chapter 3. Ascari Nate Martin, when inspired by love, takes note with a silent nod intended to point out things that he loves to the one he loves as his love. But Maggie Fornetti, when it comes to love, wants more than a nod, more than shadow boxing. Take that and that and that, she says to herself, sarcastically, dismally. A strong wind is blowing rings around them, hardly noticeable at first. Shadows flit, leaves pretending to dance with themselves, flirt with the shadows. But now shadows and leaves are dodging, ducking, seeking refuge behind each other, done with dancing, and then with batting at each other. They would gladly drag whole trees after them to escape the wind. I'm not sheltered in arms, Maggie Fornetti thinks to herself involuntarily, touching her hip bones through her coat pockets. Maggie Fornetti must have had a pleasant childhood. She understands very little about human nature. Pleasantly aware of appearing thoughtful, watching Maggie thinks of Nate investigating, going on with only what he calls piece A and piece B. Piece C, she says to him, connects them. It comes between them, not after. Chapter 2. Along comes Mrs. Sally Dover. It's now after 4, now after school. Mrs. Sally Dover is wearing yellow, violet, blue. She has semblance. Her memories are trapezed. It's now, after all. It has always been for Sally Dover, thinks Sally Dover, not Chapter 1, but Chapter 3. Resentment never loses its specificity. Resentment always takes itself to itself. Resentment continues, talking to itself. Sally Dover, she laughs at what she has, what she hears, but the laughter's a far cry from merriment. She's always hated the carousel with its turning and terrifying horses getting nowhere, hating herself. She's happiest at home, aloft in her yellow pajamas. When she complains, her allusions are anything but vague. She never says women when she means Nina Lee, though when she says Nina Lee hates me, she means that women hate her. Mothers are always suspicious of their children's teacher, says Tricia Jones, who isn't trying to comfort Sally Dover, but only to dispel her anxiety, i.e. to make her shut up. They love you, says Sally Dover bitterly. Sally Dover is 32. Point of view of Chapter 2. Faces everywhere. Faces bend to the soft valley without emotion except that of ended joy. The young Marine thinks he can't see beyond faces. There's nothing behind them. He thinks of loud stormy nights and grasses, the sand and dead mice, the battlefield, the population, a lost purse, a dark vehicle. The young Marine keeps his words at his cheek. He thinks he's nothing himself but a face at the doorstep with nothing behind him, but trees perhaps hiding the sky. Why would trees go to such extremes as to hide the sky? In the forest they are seen by their fellows. The young Marine thinks nothing follows. Chapter 3. Ascari Nate Martin shouldn't have been awakened for something that shouldn't have happened, but it did, and only a block from his apartment, where he had been dreaming until awakened that he was having dinner with Samuel Johnson, who was saying invention, as he tore the gristle and gray edges away from the red center of a great slab of beef on his plate just before the phone rang, is a faculty given to clowns that's not given to cows. Stepping into the field, Ascari Nate Martin scowls, and monkey to man, the scampering sun scowls back, as man to monkey, the sun fires. Graciela Parker has been found. Chapter 1 introduces Chapter 3. A crime has occurred in Chapter 3, maybe more than one. That's for Ascari Nate Martin to discover. But in Chapter 2, Maggie Fornetti considers bicycling past the police station in the hopes of encountering, as if by chance, Ascari Nate Martin. She dismounts. It is explicable, but not necessary, that Quinlan happens to take a snapshot of Lola at just this moment. Quinlan explains that the photographer's interest is not sincere, but neither is it patronizing. It's momentary, random, reactive. He catches Maggie Fornetti with Ascari Nate Martin. Maggie Fornetti is far too human to care for art. Or is she far too human not to care for art? She knows she can't have it both ways and would like to ask Quinlan what he thinks. She has a picture that she studies with great delicacy, and a violin that she plays without melancholy, and no one's bad opinion, she vows, will keep her from satisfying her curiosity. But she is highly susceptible to opinions. These are, to her regret, what she is too often curious about. Chapter 2. Every child has a dog to call her own, his or her own. Every dog heels, sits, and somersaults on command. Every dog can beg and count to 3. Every mother has a child who can do the same. The ranks swell and then diminish. Citizens sigh. Ascari Nate Martin takes a ghostly interest in Maggie Fornetti. He wants access to her past, her childhood games, how she scribbled in her workbooks, the source of the scar on her shin, the memento vivi of Maggie Fornetti. Circles, scenes, and conjunctions, no peace. To think it a mere appearance, to think that Lola sees it sink. She makes only a brief appearance at this time to say irritably that it takes her time to appear. There are wires in hand to speak to the lights of what's to come. There's a little scab on the skin over the clavicle of a man on the beach. Dang, says a child, Lola thinks to call Maria when she wins at bingo. Dang, says a general, others generally think to call when he wins a war. What a circus. Chapter 1. The spectators are attentive and now fall spontaneously silent, as if they've been given precise instructions. Being eager to please, they are determined to be pleased almost bitterly. They await the unfolding of events, and then, in their total innocence, the escape from what they will discover others desire, no matter that what others desire lurks in close proximity. Like long-distance truckers or tourists, the possibility that they will see someone eviscerated or mauled is among their ugliest fantasies, an expression of their greatest sorrow. And a sorry lot they are, says Quinlan, lowering his camera just as Lola comes along. Chapter on view. Memo and Dolores teeter between wonder and annoyance. Memo and Dolores, at 9 and 11, are too young to know how dangerous a cliché can be, how quickly and gratuitously it can kill. It's fun just to be out, as if in Amazonia, alone except for each other and the chameleon called Eleanor. Dolores has Eleanor in her hand. Where there was no breeze at all, now there is suddenly wind. Happiness, sadness, plovers and companionship and information and consul generals. Many years ago, after his fall, Lorenzo Fornetti's vocabulary changed completely. It shifted. It now existed only nowhere, where he found a meaning for words like Roth and Mott and Pum and Slemmy, none of which meant Chianti or botanical gardens or Karl Marx or lion trainers. Carolina, Francesca, and Maggie and neighbors and doctors ruled those out. He'd stamp in frustration and rephrase what he'd said. In the end, the trick wasn't to discover what he didn't mean, but what he did, and they never mastered it. His words were as magical as a juggler's balls. To hear him talk was spellbinding. Flirtatiously, Fredo runs his fingertips up Frankie's thigh with sudden bravado, and Frankie jumps as a horse might. It's delightful. He shies. Litter swirls. The weeds brush against the cyclone fence. Adieu, forest, Frankie says, waving at a band of adolescents who are grouping themselves together to be photographed by Quinlan. Chapter on the side of 312. We want to piss in brilliant colors, say Montgomery, Bill, and Drew. Chapter 1. I'm called Charles, says Charles to Frankie, and this is my wife, Dora. Eagerly, Frankie says his name is Frankie, but my real name, he says, as if he'd only just this moment received it, is France. And am I right to guess that you are from France, too, as it were? From Lyon in the west, says Charles, yes. This is Fredo, Frankie says. Hola, Fredo says. The sun is drifting like a tourist through a country market overhead. We have arrived to escape Lyon, Dora says. Everything is dead there, living every day. Living every day for the person living it should not be a negligible part of a long biographical act, says Fredo to his surprise. We cannot know the name, says Dora, drawing her shawl closer to her chest. Of what? Charles asked irritably. Of living every day, Dora says. Then let's call it a circus and admit rings, says Frankie, each as different from another as the minute before noon is from the minute after, which is when, having parted from Frankie and Fredo, Charles and Dora find Graciela Parker lying as if asleep among the poppies Dora's thought to pick at the edge of the parking lot among the tall gold weeds. It's against the law to pick those, hey, Helen is shouting as Dora whimpers, shudders, and screams. Later she will remember the moment at random as one she would never justly foresee, mournfully, angrily. Nearby, a kid is standing on the rear bumper of Charles and Dora's red-rented Dodge, scratching O-L-L-E-H into the rear window glass. Lola goes by, fleetingly. Lola, voila. Chapter 1. A novelist is no more a scientist than a snake charmer is a herpetologist, or a tightrope walker is an engineer, or a cook is a chemist, or a voting booth is a sanctuary, or a confession is an autobiography, or the folding of the nomad's hammock is a surrender of territory. A goldfish is no more a guard dog than a divorcee's guilt is a balancing rod in the hands of the tightrope walker making his or her way from the Arctic to Antarctica or vice versa. Go, little pebble. Go, shoe. Go, accountants in trances. Go, missionaries distributing rice to saxophone players on tour in the Sierras. Go naked. So that's the Lola Project. There's about it's about two-thirds more long, two-thirds longer. And ultimately, I'm hoping to publish it as a diptych with a work called The Distance, which is also underway, which is a sea saga. So I want to call it Saga Circus. And the sea saga is extraordinarily 19th century, so I can't publish it by itself. I would lose total credibility. So I have to couch it with this circus madness. And now I want to read a little bit for a change of pace, I think, radical, from this little book called Slowly. And it's larded with adverbs. And my thought was, I wanted... there's an amazingly brilliant poet, friend of mine named Leslie Scalapino, and in a conversation with her about her work, she used the phrase that her work represented continual conceptual rebellion, and by which she meant that one had to undertake continual conceptual rebellion in order, again, to quote her, to outrun the forces of destruction. And the two forces of destruction, or the two sites of the forces of destruction, are the social world, in which people observe other people and have concepts about who they are and rigidify those people and deform them into what the social thinks they are or should be. So you have to outrun the forces of the social, however you want to conceive of what the social consists of. And the other force of destruction that you have to outrun are your own concepts, that you have to keep rethinking who you are. So you have to outrun yourself. And I really like this, I immensely admire this notion of Scalapino's. And I liked and admired and wanted to adopt all parts of it except the running part, since, as any of you who attended my talk yesterday will know, I am currently engaged in undertaking a challenge to the speed of contemporary life. So I thought one possible way to undertake continual conceptual rebellion was to slow down and let the forces of distraction go right past me. So the title of this is Slowly. And once I had launched into it, it's actually not about continual conceptual rebellion, but actually the adverbs are an attempt to underscore, to perform ways of thinking not only about what one does, but how one does it. And as sort of following, I share Gertrude Stein's obsession with grammar, and if one were to diagram the sentences in this little poem, one would discover that they are all absolutely grammatically correct. That is, you can diagram a sentence which says, she quickly peeled the apple slowly. There's room in a diagram for those adverbs. And really, if you think about it, you can. So I'm not going to read all of this, just some of it. But I am starting at the beginning. I wake to the waking shadow of the world the waking have in common for one long visit slowly. I walk rather than speed up the ordinary unfolding. One has to wait for the lateness of the day with recalcitrance circulating to stop in the midst of traffic in a blind spot that flows around one smoothly to regard the dark building without apology. Movement prolongs the finitudes a person moving achieves, which lacks finality imperceptibly. Out the back door, over black leaves, putting into motion what painters have known for years, I see that the night is in the mind before it ever gets to the day. Colors creating forms are left for the imagination to turn from birds in flight to photographs of same or nearly same. The middle of my face aches as if with cold. A physicist can detect as an acceleration I'm slowing. Or there might be scores. A physician scorning dreams should nonetheless excise as extended omens. Omens always have a psychological twist, indomitable will exercises. When one clearly sees, what one clearly sees comes up momentarily in implausibly submerged assertions as generosity. Slowly, things, partly because of damage, are represented as ghosts grown too quickly. Repetitive exposure to anything provokes sensations. Lettered passers-by pass by what history has for us. The vanquished sit at the center of their world, intransigently outskirting. My eye caught the light, a rock approximately the size of a head, and something was said regarding fate surreptitiously. Each fate is phrased, fate in sequences. My hand mentally grabs the glass just before it hits the floor suddenly. Fate is a term for the present, a name for time regained. Clichés develop in the dark, and they are known in a flash as hallucinations. In the one called Wouldn't You Know It, a dachshund comes out from under the bed. It is the usual dachshund, the decisively irascible fat one. If I had to do it all over again, I'd call it Beethoven, and after a while, lately. But the hallucination known as to do it all over again takes the kind of time we are immediately fated not to have. The inability to remember, except perhaps some vague and distant storeroom, causes doubt, whose reach is independent of everything that might happen after breakfast tomorrow, but the present. The bird we saw yesterday in the tree constantly sings outwardly. Fate can never, in a new way, nor as before, overcome its dependence on the present once and for all. When inertia sets in, things that are in motion stay in motion. Things that are stationary stay put. For the onlooker, tossing in her bed, given too much information, the magic square judiciously disappears. The information whispered by the wristwatch counts not 4, but 2 nothing as it continues. Its brief halts for repentance, erroneously considered an instant of knowledge, are always on the question. Contrition is itself a form of query. Subjectivity, even if not of the curling sky, is my duration. All day, subjectivity is an endurance awaiting objects for a minute digressing. And it hopes for objects, eager and unbaffled, in spaces somewhere near eye level, to greet it with comprehension during its waking hours. Everyone knows that in the dream called, Will my spirit live on when I'm dead? As in the dream called, Will I be fired? and the dream called, "Do you only pretend to love me?" there are no objects. In the dream called, "One who is poor passes by inch, there is no object. Subjectivity at night must last hours with nothing to judge by itself. The walls of the hemispheres face, and this produces life to closing, admiring eyes. More northward than westward, without cease, to my left withdraws what earlier to my right rose. I have observed this gradually. I don't know that I've gently noted what's been turned over. I know there's been a loading of the light with darkness, and then a loading of the dark with light, and to the forces at work tediously at both, I felt kindly. But kindness, though it requires enormous energy, may be a mark of laziness. No one telephones harshly to challenge one's acts of kindness, if those acts exhibit kindness toward them. We carry disillusionment a certain distance and come to the screen. My wall is projected. Finding the door, I choose it and am exposed. That's all freedom is, the choices required of one, summing one up. The time is right, the place outlasting. As my passport indicates, I was born nearby. There is nothing self-producing, nothing authentic. Naturally, circumnavigators achieve circularity. It is no one departing from herself. Pursuit can't be separated from routines, clothing, meals, and eventually music, which is never made for others alone. The interlocutor may ask, never? The circumnavigator says, we never stop. Interlocutor, believing that some horses have blue eyes? Certainly, says the circumnavigator, while we laboriously wait for things to resemble what we want things to be. Interlocutor, tearing through a field of ripening corn accidentally? Circularity, says the circumnavigator, slows to allow the time of a place to appear. With or without future, asks the interlocutor. Clairvoyance does not occur in the ellipses we know as dreams, and therefore, says the circumnavigator, it does not appear in the dreams of dogs any more than it occurs in ours. Dreaming to think accidentally, slowly to no outcome. I go slowly in acknowledgement and know I'll have to go there again. Events have many centers, and they fall into ruins like solemnly decomposing cliffs usefully. They while away. If you know little about hot springs and volcanoes, then you can look them up. There will always be a hole in the picture, or holes will appear abundantly without useful copy, however. This describes things historically, like mystification. We think for ourselves. But not only that, look up history. Look up cloud quantity, see organization, suction, cascade, antonym, fixity. Look up cascade, see deliberation, failure, sincerest repeat. Look up sincerest repeat, see aftermath. Look up aftermath, see fugue, history, perceptible color. Look up perceptible color, see unit of cognition, common sense, paint. Look up paint, see painting, antonym blank. Look up painting, see critical inches, see color above. Cobalt, gray, viridian, gray lake, inch, look up. Look up inch, see premonition, fabric, millimeters. Look up millimeters, see wider films, see fate ramble, fate flicker, reality sucking up fate. It's rare to see fate sweating. Observation doesn't reveal one's own reality, but the reality of things that are foreign to one, proving one's alienation, one's unreality, a very nice creature and rare. Whoa, whoa, back up. Whoa, what's that? Quickly. And then I think I'll end just with a couple of shorter works from another work in progress, which I've been working on for years, the title of which is The Book of a Thousand Eyes. It's an homage to Scheherazade. All right, I'll read these. There in your hand is an emerald hoe. You have gone to the basement. You have come to the window. You have forgotten our names. Everyone but you is seasick, and you aren't because you don't lock your knees as you stand on the deck. You ride the waves. You flow. There in your hand is a mixing stick, and you live in the land of our mothers and incarnations, and you see things turning, flowers into fate, pebbles into water, ripe berries into people who begin immediately to hunt and copulate and prepare food and quarrel. There in your hand is a viola bow. You are more than 70 years old now, or maybe half of that, or perhaps 1,000. You are a stranger now, or someone who is yet to appear, but of whom we have a premonition, and the children know your name. There in your hand is a mirror reflecting a cloud. You are moving slowly and also quickly. You live in a barn with legs. You refuse to be bossed around, and you spill the ink. Word goes out to pigeons, or maybe they are penguins who are carrying the message. There in your hand is a message we can't read. You are as quiet and complete as an egg, and when it breaks, there in your hand is a tile, and on it are our names. Perhaps someone wrong enough is right to be wrong. Perhaps nations ought not to hunt people they care nothing about. Necessity is a state of incapacity, but perhaps incapacity is a state of necessity. Everything changes, but perhaps the whole remains, although it seems unlikely as well as undesirable. There is nothing but reality. Once there was a man named Task in Life, and there is no perhaps about that. There can't be perhaps about anything that is, but perhaps there is. Perhaps this Task in Life was a poor soldier with holes in his boots, a bad back, and warped arrows. Every proposition comes to an end, but perhaps the end brought about by a negation is more of an end than an end brought about by an affirmation. Something cannot be more or less of an end, so the end announced by yes and the end announced by no are equally false ends. Perhaps there was once a horse named Predication, but perhaps it was called Trepidation or Shadow. Loyalty tolerates a degree of doubt in its vicinity, but doubt has a tendency to turn a vicinity into a swamp, in which a soldier like Task in Life is apt to get his boots sucked off. If there was once a horse named High Spot, the distinction between High Spot and a star would have been clear. High Spot, a mollusk, show tunes, vivacity, and a star. Perhaps affirmation prolongs what it affirms, negation curtails what it negates, but the temporal advantage that affirmation has over negation is probably insignificant. But perhaps at this point, the notion that nothing is insignificant should be affirmed. Perhaps noise moves the air, perhaps air moves noise, and perhaps we can have it both ways. Doubt is a source of questions, but questions are also a source of doubt. Perhaps everything ends gradually in a single dilemma, but if so, the dilemma in question is suddenly limitless. Perhaps plants live upside down, or perhaps they eat with their feet. And then last poem. I have this to say, but I don't know when to. There was a great forest that I went to. I may never return there, but I want to. I have just one memory of it, and I want to. Thank you.